It is tradition that we have for the Bitter Lake Food Bank at these meetings. So I'm going to pass the envelope around. Please add into it if you'd like. Thank you. I also like to remind everyone that we want you to become a member. So if you are not a member, we encourage you to become a member here at Howler Lake Community Club because we're a great place. It's very affordable, $20 for your household a year. You can't beat that. So please consider supporting this great building that has been running for 102 years, all on volunteers. So thank you. You can sign up to be a member on our website. Upcoming events that we have on December 14th, we have our community dance, which is a great live music, a live taller for all ages, kids, seniors. It's great fun. It's a great workout. If you like to dance or even think about dancing, come check it out, or just want to listen to the music. It's at 6:30. It's the second Saturday of the month. We also have this month our Holiday Bazaar. That will be on December 15th from 10 to 4 p.m. We have, I think, 25 vendors coming. We're trying to support local crafters and local small businesses. So it should be a fun place to shop if you have some extra shopping to do right before Christmas. We'll also have live music from Ingram, from Lakeside, and the theater organ. So it should be a fun thing to stop by for. And a cookie share if you want to bring your favorite cookie. 10 to 4. My last announcement is about this upzoning, which you probably most of you saw on your way in. So there's a lot of upzoning that's going to be happening in our neighborhood. And I encourage you to educate yourself on it. You have until December 20th to give feedback to the city. And it's obviously, there are many good things about creating more homes around, housing around the light rail, and we don't not want to support that, but Howler Lake Community Club is also standing up to ask the city to not upzone right along the lake. So we respect that they're going to upzone on the outskirts of our community, but right within the middle of our community, on 122nd, Densmore, and 128th, around the lake from Meridian to Meridian, we're asking the city not to allow apartment building development there. So, and I really encourage, we need everybody to send a letter. So you can write your own letter. I have a letter that's on our website in our newsletter for December that you can cut and paste. There's a letter on the table over there you can copy, take a picture of, but send something if you care about it, because I think it would be nice to hold on to the middle of our community as not being developed into apartments. So thank you, and I'll pass it over to Sean.
My name is Sean McPherson. Kippy and I were lucky to be on the board with Scott Sheehan, who is the executive director of Marshallese Cemetery. And I just thought, God, I'd love to know more about that place. So I asked him if he would be willing to do it, and he said he would. So Scott is our speaker tonight. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much. Make it just a little bit easier for everyone to see. All right, well, thank you very much for having me here tonight. And hopefully we can take a little time and I'll try to connect the dots a little bit of the history for Evergreen Washelli and how that ties into the community. So, and then hopefully we'll have some time as well so that I can spend a little bit of time maybe answering a few questions, because it seems like there's always an opportunity to answer a few questions. And I never stop learning. The more people I meet, the more I know, the more I understand and realize how much I don't know, especially when it comes to history. So it's, I have been extraordinarily fortunate to be a part of Evergreen Washelli for quite some time now. Got to give you a little bit of my background so you can see the lens that I look at things through, especially when it comes to our work. Is I grew up and I started in funeral service when I was about, give or take, 15, 16 years old. Started working at a funeral home in Butte, Montana, and where I've grown up. And that's where I began that process of knowing what I would do for the rest of my life. And it's kind of funny, and I guess I feel very fortunate because once I started, there was never a question of what I would do. It took a little while to accomplish it, to get there, but that's where I started to learn a little bit about funeral service and develop that and into both the funeral side and into the cemetery side. And once I got bit by the cemetery bug, it was all over. It just fascinates me. If you were to talk to any of my girls, they would tell you that any town we go to, anywhere we go, there is going to be at least one cemetery that we're going to be going to. It's a foregone conclusion. They know it, they understand it. Fortunately, they kind of enjoy it, so I appreciate that. So in order to kind of talk about Evergreen Washelli, let's take a few minutes and allow ourselves the freedom to drift back in time. We're going to allow that to go back quite a ways. And I also want you to do one other thing as we begin. Allow your brain for just a few minutes to be your 19-year-old brain. Okay? So we're going to take a few minutes as we do that. We're going to go back to about 1851. And the origin story of Seattle is really the origin story of Evergreen Washelli. Now we just need to connect some dots to get there. So David Denny was 19 years old, very young man. And it was his family and other settlers that would be the first to arrive at Alki. David was part of 3 gentlemen who came to Alki. They were kind of the lead group that came out. Some of the other folks were still back in Oregon. And part of their goal was to see what lied in front of them and to prepare the ground, if you will, for the rest of the folks to arrive. So as they did that, 2 of the gentlemen headed back to let the rest of the team know we're ready. We're going to move north. And then David's goal was to kind of get the rest of the things ready for them. They had started a little bit of protection, a small cabin, very rough in nature. He was going to get the roof on that, try to, because this is December, I believe it was, and so we've got rain, we've got cold. Sure enough, David whacks his leg with an axe and injures himself, so he spent more time trying to stay huddled up with the pine boughs and stay warm while the roof dripped water. So the rest of the team arrives on Alki. The full party arrives. There was 10 adults, 12 children. And that was on actually November 13th, 1851 when they arrived. They came on the schooner by the name of Exact. And it is said that they arrived and all the ladies and all the gentlemen got off and sat down and had a good cry to start with because they realized just how much work was in front of them. But as with any pioneers, they looked ahead and said, this is what we signed up for. And they began getting the cabin ready, getting a roof on, getting some protection, starting to work. There was a community there of Native Americans in a few different areas, starting to build those relationships. So they were on ground, they were on foot. Interesting enough, in that party, one of the passengers on the Exact was also the 24-year-old Louisa Oren. We're going to come back to Louisa in just a little bit. Then on May 23rd of 1853, the first plat for the town of Seattle was created. One of the things that happens in any growing community, you have new pioneers coming in, you have building going on, you have businesses being developed, and it was a very rough and tumble time. One of the realizations that occurred is that deaths were starting to happen. And there's the uncertainty of going, well, what do we do now? So if we look back in history, although it's a little cloudy at certain points, there were a few different areas where deceased individuals were placed. One of those was Maynard's Point. There was another, interestingly enough, that was what we will call, for the sake of our conversation, Denny Hotel Cemetery, because there's really no name to the cemetery, but it's known that there were burials that were placed there. Eventually, Denny Hotel came there. So the bodies that were placed there, it was a small cemetery, But at this, just a little while later, we had another occurrence going on, and that was the formation of what was called the White Church. That was the first church in Seattle. That was Reverend Bagley and his wife that started that church. Well, if you come from anywhere in the Midwest, of course, the South and much of the East, your small communities, if you have a church, good chance you're going to have a little cemetery right next to the church. Well, sure enough, I think it was on the southeast corner, they created a small cemetery, which was really kind of recognized, if you will, as the first formal cemetery in Seattle at that point in time.
Where were these spots?
That spot for the Denny Hotel was at kind of in the area of 2nd and Stewart, 1st and Pine, in that block, in that area right there. That's where the hotel sat, and that's where some of those burials took place, is in that area.
Are they still there?
No, and I'm going to touch on that here in just a second. That was a picture that you see there of the Little White Church. So it kind of gives you a concept of what it looked like back in the day. That picture goes back quite some time. So let's chat a little bit more about how that ties together. David and Louisa ended up being married just a short time after they were here, maybe a year and some change. So they were the first married couple in Seattle, as we understand. And that David and Louisa born, of course, and so that they were married, was in a cabin, I believe, of a friend of theirs, and then they made their homestead here in Seattle, of course, at that point in time. Over the years, they would have 8 children in the years ahead. One of those children comes into the story, and that's son, baby Jonathan. Jonathan and his brother, there were twins that were born. One brother would grow into adulthood. Jonathan died as a young baby. And Jonathan, Denny, plays a very important role in our conversation tonight. And I'll rock back and forth in time a little bit, but at that point in time, David and Louisa decided that they would place Jonathan at the Little White Church Cemetery. So that's where baby Jonathan was placed at that point in time. Seattle, of course, now is growing more. There's more population. Things are happening. The Seattle leaders at that time understood we need to do something in a more formal matter for a cemetery. That's a definite need that we're going to have, along with all of the other things that are happening at that point in time. Seattle is definitely taking on a city feel. It's rough, it's tumbled, but you could see it was thriving, it was succeeding. There was a lot of growth going on. And there was several things that happened. As it became a city, then there were some different ordinances that came into play, and they finally started to address some of the needs. For example, ordinance number 15 in the city had to do with putting some parameters around deaths and burials. That is lost to time because a lot of that verbiage was lost in the Great Fire, but we do know some pieces of that. Ordinance number 36 was the ordinance that said we will create a cemetery. That's when they decided to make Seattle Cemetery. A decade, mind you, after the fact that when it was dedicated, they'd already been buried there. But how it came to be was that there was a piece of ground that Louisa and Denny had, and that David had, and David Denny really wanted that piece of ground to be a park, to be a city park. He also understood the need of the city and said, okay, I'm going to concede 5 acres of that we will allow to become a cemetery. And that was the first municipal cemetery for Seattle, which was Seattle Cemetery. They had donated that land. At that time, they also put some parameters such as that was the time frame where they said, okay, we should probably have things like some type of a book of keeping track of who dies. that's a great idea. Things like maybe even a death certificate. And so all of a sudden they started to put some rails around that to say, if a death occurs, we should have then maybe a permit so that we know who's buried where and those kinds of things. Because if you look back in time, there's a lot of these little communities and a lot of these little cemeteries, and you'll find this all over where we just don't know who is buried there, where they're buried, how far out they are, those kinds of things. So they started to really put some effort and some work into that as they did that. They also created what was called the cemetery sexton. The cemetery sexton was the person that takes care of the cemetery, is responsible for burials, for taking care of things, some maintenance, those kinds of things. That term you will hear quite often in days of yesteryears, the cemetery sexton. Interestingly enough, back in the day, if you read the wording that they used, the cemetery sexton was interesting because they did all of that. They also had the authority of a police officer within the cemetery. Well, interestingly enough, we jump forward years in Title 68, which is where all of our RCWs are, or revised codes are at for cemetery. The sexton, in theory, still has those same abilities. We don't exercise that very much because it's very dangerous. But it's kind of interesting that a lot of the early writings that you see, they've changed over the years, but many are similar to what they started many, many years ago here in Seattle. Also determined that plots in the municipal cemetery would be $10, and they also identified, which most cemeteries do, an area called Potter's Field. Potter's Field is typically for those folks that don't have a family. They may be indigent, don't have any funds to be taken care of, but they set aside a portion of that ground so that those individuals would be taken care of. And that isn't uncommon in a municipal cemetery as well, that you will see that throughout the country.
You have that at Washeli?
What's that?
Do you have that at Washeli?
They never did at Washeli on either the Washeli side or the Evergreen side, but rather, instead of having a specific area, it was dealt more with on those individual basis, so they could be by either a family member or a friend. But going back, especially at those pioneer days, there were so many folks that there was nobody to even make the decision. So they simply said, we have to do something with them. What is it? They'd create an area where that's where they would go. No family, nobody to take care of, nobody to take responsibility, etc.
I know that they have that up at Mount Pleasant.
Yeah, there's, if you go back there, there's probably areas like that, and that kind of goes into a whole nother channel of conversation about certain groups and that did that. The Chungwa Association built an area specifically for folks that had nothing, and they had bought property just for the indigents at that. So there is a bit of a history there if you look at that. So now we have Seattle in 1869 officially incorporated. 15 said we're going to regulate. 36 said we're going to create the sexton. 346 said we're going to have death and birth certificates. We are on a roll. Then, now mind you, this is just 20 years after they went through all the rigmarole. Denny donated the land. We're going to create the Seattle Cemetery. Out of the blue, proposition before City Seattle Council to abandon Seattle Cemetery. Ordinance 571 said, July 1884, we will convert Seattle Cemetery to a public park. There's one little problem. Well, we got 223 graves in there, but we're going to abandon that. We're going to condemn it as a cemetery, and it will now be a park. So, some decisions had to be made. They formed the Seattle Cemetery Commission. David Denny, along with a few other individuals, were on that commission. It was also, I've seen it referred to as the Parks Commission, but part of it was specifically for the cemetery. Their goal was to do a couple of things. They had to figure out, what are we going to do? We've got to have land that we're going to create a new cemetery, and more importantly, we've got to figure out, what are we going to do with these 223 bodies? So that was part of the work and the effort of the commission to be able to do that. And so they really put a lot of work and effort into it. From what I could see and what I could research, one of the individuals was very meticulous about the work that they did. And we'll see here in just a minute all of the responsibilities. What they did is that they had put the contract out, and they assigned that to a gentleman by the name of Oliver C. Shorey. Oliver came here in about 1861. He was a cabinet maker, woodworker, and he and another gentleman had a cabinet making shop, and then they added the undertaker side to that. And that in history is very, very common, is that you will find that many funeral homes, if you look at their heritage, it comes back to that was the guy that did the woodworking, was the cabinet maker, and inevitably became the undertaker. It kind of went hand in hand. Well, Shorey said, well, we think we can do that, and then they looked at the responsibility. They were going to have to dig the graves, they were going to have to confirm the identities, they were going to have to move the stones. In most all of the cases, going to have to put the remains into a new casket, a new container, if you will. They have all of that responsibility to take on and to do that. And to do that, they were paid a total sum of $3,000 for that. That firm became later Bonnie and Stewart, and today is Bonnie Watson. So the Bonnie name came in there, partnered with Shorey, then with another individual and family. And so when you see that, that happens to be one of their horse-drawn hearses of Bonnie and Stewart, and now today's Bonnie Watson Company. So they were the individuals that took that responsibility on, and it was a huge task, for sure. So now we enter second cemetery, the second Seattle Municipal Cemetery, and interestingly enough, we're going to see a couple of fun things in here. So they said, well, where's it going to be? Well, we've got a great idea. Up on top of Capitol Hill, we're sitting on about 40 acres. We're sitting on 40 acres because yonder back a while, we bought that for about, I think it was $2,000, bought that acreage, because we were convinced, I don't know why we were convinced, we shouldn't have been, but we were convinced that we were going to be the state capital. Now, mind you, the territory capital was already in Olympia. They had that dog slayed, and yet they were convinced. And so they bought that property ahead of time, and that property was hoping to be the capital building. Well, it was quickly decided that, okay, that ship has sailed, that's not going to happen. And so they said, let's do this, let's go ahead and dedicate a portion of that ground to become the municipal cemetery. It will be the second cemetery for Seattle, and the remains can go there. As it turns out, the remains went a couple of different directions. At that point, there was the Catholic cemetery, there was the new cemetery there. There was also a Masonic cemetery. We'll touch back on that because that will come around. And so the families could decide where they were going to go if there was a family. Part of the task that they ran into with the commissioners is they couldn't find anybody. They couldn't find the next of kin because, think about it, the pioneers, families had moved on, they were gone. So where they could, they would find them, they would get permission. Where they couldn't, they would say, okay, we're going to move them from here to here. They most likely then went to the second Seattle cemetery. Others went to those other cemeteries as time went by. So then they came up with the thought of, okay, we've got a cemetery, we should call it something. What are we going to call it? So they kind of put word out, and different names came in, and it happened to be that Mary Leary, who was the wife of the mayor at that time, got involved with that. And she had a friend by the name of Gilchrist, was his last name, and let me get that for you because I'm drawing a blank on his first name. You might recognize it. It was Gilchrist Swan was his name. At the time, he was noted as being kind of an expert in indigenous people and the tribes surrounding that area. She reached out to him and said, here's what we got going. We got a cemetery. I need a name. Do you have any suggestions? And it was actually in Gilchrist Swan's diary that he said that he gave her the name Washelli, that it meant west wind. And that referencing it against what Hiawatha had said, that it meant that that was the region of the hereafter. So Washelli Cemetery would be the cemetery of the hereafter. And so, lo and behold, on February 5th of 1885, ordinance number 642 was passed to create Washelli Cemetery, which sat on top of Capitol Hill. So that was a lot of work, right? We've done a ton of work now. We've made moves, we've had to go through this process, we've allocated property. Whew, we can take a breath. I mean, we're making headway, but that is a lot of work. And then, just a few short years later, there is ordinance number 877. I call this the you could put an expletive in front of that, kidding me. So, with that cemetery, little sidebar here, just so you know, because where I'm going to go with this is to answer a couple questions. But when this happens, you'll see this. That look familiar? Everybody's heard of Volunteer Park? Lakeview Park? City Park? Okay. Here we go. Let's go back here for just a second. So, they say, yep, we're going to condemn it. This is only 2-3 years later. They say, nope, we're not going to have Washelli Cemetery anymore. We're going to close up, and guess what? We want another park. So now, many decisions need to be made. Families now have possibly made 1 or 2 or 3 changes of remains going to a cemetery and then to another cemetery. So at this point, this is an interesting crossroads, because as we get to that crossroads, we get to the story back to Baby Jonathan. Baby Jonathan was buried at White Church. A few years later, they decided, because Dad had died and he had gone to Seattle Cemetery, they said, let's move Baby Jonathan to Seattle Cemetery. So now Jonathan's been at White Church, he's at Seattle Cemetery. Now that is being condemned, and everybody's going to have to go to the newest cemetery. David Denny and Louisa said, no, I don't think so. So they made the decision at that point that they owned property out by Licton Springs, at Oak Lake, and they said, we're going to go out there and we're going to create a place for our family. We're going to create a place so Baby Jonathan doesn't have to be moved again. And mind you, at that time, that was said to be a full buggy day ride out of Seattle. Mm-hmm. It was not an easy path to get there. Enter Oak Lake Cemetery. So, a couple of really interesting things in here. So with that fork in the road, they make that decision to do that, and they want to place Baby Jonathan out there, which is great. Here's a piece of the story that most people don't recognize, is that when the Denny's came out and they placed Baby Jonathan, they placed him on land that wasn't theirs. It was actually the U.S. government's. So interestingly enough, and you can see there must have been some behind-the-scenes work going on here, but another individual by the last name of Eddie was hoping to get that exact property and a homestead from the U.S. government. It was already in play. but they wanted to get baby Jonathan buried, so they actually buried him, made the placement, and then Eddie was able to get the homestead from the government. Less than a week later, David Denny bought that ground for $800. So he then owned that ground. But when Jonathan was buried, the U.S. government still owned the land. So it's kind of just a fun aside, if you will. So, interestingly enough, it wasn't until 1891 that David and Louisa filed the plat for that. I did put this picture up for Oak Lake School because it was founded in 1886, and we have a seasoned veteran of Oak Lake School here.
Yes.
So I just thought that the timing was really interesting, because that was about 1884 that they did that original, and then that school. And Denny had also donated the land for that school as well. So he was incredibly generous in the things that he did with the community. That is actually the recorded copy of the property in 1891. So there was no hurry to file that, but finally they said we should officially file the plat with the city. But it's kind of interesting. I want to read to you what they put on it. Part of this, some say, was just being a little humorous, and some was it was a little bit of a rub. But I appreciated a couple things in there. He said the object of the undersigned in laying out this tract of land as a cemetery is to furnish a burial place for those who need the same, irrespective of nationality, color, or previous condition of servitude, where the rich and the poor will be on equality, where the tax gatherer and the book agent will not ply their vocation, and where interest at 10% per annum is not reckoned up and added to the principal every 30 days. So, said all the right things and put a little zing right there at the end of it. But that was the original document from 1891. Now, we enter his son. His son is Victor W.S. Denny and American Necropolis. So, in 1903 is when they transferred the name, the property title and such, over to Victor Denny. Just a few short years later, David would die. David would be buried a few feet away from his son Jonathan. But in this process, they transferred it over to Victor Denny. Victor operated the cemetery for a number of years. Everything kind of went on pretty much as normal until we get to about 1914. And it's a little bit interesting in this one too, because there's something behind the veil there that I don't quite understand. But Victor decided to sell the cemetery, and he sold it to a gentleman by the name of Silas Clark. And so he sold the cemetery at that time for $27,500 to Mr. Clark. Within days, Mr. Clark transfers title over to the American Necropolis Company. And so where you figured out is that on the papers that were filed when they incorporated, Mr. Clark was the superintendent for American Necropolis. So he was a bit of an agent, if you will, for them. Bought it from Denny, then they transferred it over to American Necropolis. American Necropolis is a company that came out of St. Louis at that time. They saw themselves, for lack of better terms, I'm probably misspeaking, but they were kind of seeing themselves as the avant-garde of cemeteries. They were going into where cemeteries had either kind of been downtrodden a bit, or that there was huge opportunity, and they saw themselves as great cemetery operators. They didn't last a ton of years, but they had pretty deep ties when you look through history. For example, if you were to look at Forest Lawn in California, which now today, and at the time that they worked with Forest Lawn and started out, it was a bedraggled, rough cemetery. It was struggling. Today, it's kind of known as the cemetery of the stars, because so many celebrities and famous individuals are buried there. And they've done they did back in the day, some really, really interesting things with cemetery development. They were very creative and they were very unusual. So it was interesting how it came to be that they put their eyes on Washelli back in the day. I do think that a piece of it was that it was growing. Yes, sir.
Just for clarification, the land we're talking about here, is this a part of Evergreen Washelli land today?
Yep, this is all of the Washelli, not all of the Washelli side, but if you pull into Washelli and you see where the Denny Rock is there, and you see the other monuments, they're all of the old area. That is all of that 40-acre tract that was all part of the original Denny property.
That's the east side of Aurora?
That would, correct, that's on the east side of Aurora. So that's where you're gonna see all the uprights.
There's a lake down there?
What's that?
No.
There's a lake down
No, when the term came from Oak Lake, that was a runoff from the spring, so it was south, it was a little bit south of the cemetery, as I best understand it. That's where that little lake was at, and that's why it was called Oak Lake.
This isn't the military cemetery part, though.
Yeah, no, this is in the same area, and I'm going to touch on that here in just a second, but that same area at the time, there wasn't a military area at that moment in time, but it's the same exact area. Yeah, that's all part of that tract right there. So that's what he sold to American Necropolis. So American Necropolis takes off and they start operating. They operated really well, and they got really creative. There's some interesting things that were happening timing-wise there, and we're going to have kind of a crash that occurs here in a second. But there were some interesting things. They were on the forefront of developing the columbarium that's there, and here's the interesting part: the columbarium and the crematory. Think about the day, 1920, 1921. Across the United States, the cremation rate it's a swing high. It might have been at 7 or 8%. And the percentage was super low. Traditional earth burial was probably 97, 98% of the deaths that occurred. So it's kind of wild when you think about it that here's this company that comes in and they take an absolute flyer and say, we're going to build an entire building and it's going to be for nothing but cremated remains for ashes in 1920. Now, the average bearer, if I was back then, I would have said, you guys are crazy. Because most people could not have fathomed how that could ever work. It's unbelievable the foresight that they may have had. And that they put in the crematories there, which was one of the first early crematories in the city of Seattle. So they did cremations for a multitude of other funeral homes at the time as well as their own. So they did that. They did the first mausoleum. They did the first development of mausoleums, and I'll show you a couple pictures of that. So they really had some stuff going on. They were very creative. They were developing hard. And this is all a matter of now what? 5 or 6 years at the most this is happening, right? And then enter the new kids. Out of the blue, there's a group of businessmen that come together and say, that property that right across from the cemetery that is just bedraggled, it's overgrown with timber, that was going to be a housing development. We think it would make a great cemetery. So a small group of individuals came together and they formed a corporation that would be Evergreen Cemetery Company of Seattle. And they put together the heads, laid out their plans, and they began working and clearing. That's a picture on the Evergreen side, looking kind of to the south and looking over to Washelli. That's a pretty good image of what they started with, as they started to clear the land over there.
How many acres?
At that time, they had purchased, I think it was about 72 acres, something like that, right in that area, of that whole area. So you can give you perspective, that is the North Trunk Road. That is Aurora Avenue. You can see the bricks that are there. So that was exactly what it looked like across the street where the trees are at on the right-hand side. That was Washelli Cemetery.
So you're heading north.
Yep, so you headed north, and this is the development that they started. And they went to town. They were working incredibly fast, incredibly hard. It's amazing when you think about that. They filed their corporate papers in 1919, right? And they began work on this. Development begins. It's clear that they are making headway. The vision that they had is simply incredible. On July 20th, 1920, they had the ground ready for the first burial of a businessman from Seattle, Hugh Beckett. So in 1920, they made their first burial. They were very bright. They made connections. They did a lot of great marketing, a lot of great advertising. They had a lot of connections in the city of Seattle. So it was a full-on battle between the two. It was clear that even in some of the advertising, one would call one this name, one would call one that name. They called the Washelli side because they had upright stones. That was the Marble Orchard. Well, one of the big things about Evergreen was they were going to do something that was very, very new at the time, and that was the idea of a memorial park. So the idea was that they didn't want to look like a traditional cemetery. The idea was to have this beautiful, serene, park-like setting that would be beautiful for families to come to, and they could develop gardens and do all of those things. That was their whole ideal at the time. And it was very new throughout the United States. There was a few different companies that had started that movement of creating a memorial park. That's why you hear the term memorial park used sometimes other than cemetery. A cemetery, typically you will have a traditional cemetery, with upright monuments, some flats, etc. That's kind of what they developed it there. So it became really clear that in another 2 short years, the gig was up. Something was going to have to give because they both weren't going to make it. So they came together, and Evergreen Cemetery Company purchased from American Necropolis Washelli. That became Evergreen Washelli Cemetery at that point in time. That's a picture of the original columbarium. Breaks my heart every time I see it because it's a beautiful structure. What we learned was the materials that it was made with and all the vibrations going up and down Aurora at that time and that old road over a very short period of time started breaking this apart and eroding it. So that's why in the 1950s, basically, 50s to 60s, they changed the entire appearance. And at the time, they thought they were being extraordinarily contemporary, making what I think is a perfectly homely building. But this was gorgeous in its day. It was a beautiful structure. But it was very clear that they were going to be very successful.
Is that the one right on Meridian?
No, that's right on Aurora. If you're going down Aurora now, it's kind of a brownish color. It's on the left-hand side. The inside of the columbarium, if nothing else, you owe it to yourself to go wander about the columbarium inside. It's a beautiful structure, and it's an amazing walk. It's like walking through a library, but it's a museum. Yep. Yep.
And is that, Scott, is that open daily? Or?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, cool.
Yep, 7 days a week. Yep. And you're always welcome to just go in and wander about. It's really, really interesting. Every friend I have in funeral service that comes out, that's one of the first places I take them because I want them to understand the foresight that they had 100 years ago. So anyway, that's a picture of the back side of it, and that was also developed into mausoleums at that same time. And with the picture that you see here is Clinton Strong Harley. C.S. Harley, I think, as I look back at that history, I think he was responsible for a great amount of what happened in those early days. He was instrumental on the very front end when they started the company. His brother was one of the investors, but they quickly named C.S. Harley the manager of the cemetery. And it was his skill and his craftiness that I think really came to light. And then he got involved with a handful of other things. As a sidebar, it was the responsibility, I think really it was Clinton, that because of his status within the veteran community, he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, he got together with many of his fellow friends and veterans and said, you know what? We need a place. We need a place. We want to have a cemetery that's just for veterans. It's for us. It was, if it wasn't for Clinton Harley, that would have never happened. And that was the formation of the Veterans Cemetery. The only mistake that I think Clint made at that time, and we all, if you're in the cemetery game, you understand the decisions you make, the mistakes you made last for the next 100 years. And that was boxed himself in just a little bit, probably didn't set aside enough property because it didn't take that many years, and all of a sudden you're boxed in and didn't have anywhere to go. And of course, keep in mind, in the city of Seattle, even if you could buy property, you can't expand a cemetery. You haven't been able to do that for decades and decades. So you can't expand a cemetery, even if you could buy the property around it. So
Why not?
that's a city ordinance. It's a city statute that you cannot do this. So, Seattle and cemeteries, clearly, if we go back 100 years, they're kind of weird, you know? So,
What's the difference between a columbarium and a mausoleum?
mausoleum. Columbarium is typically 100% for ashes, for cremated remains and placement of urns. A mausoleum is typically designed to be built for full body caskets. So a full casket will go into a mausoleum crypt versus an urn will go into a niche in a columbarium. That's usually the difference. And you'll see oftentimes a combination of both. With this, there's another building behind it, and to the side of the main columbarium is pretty much all cremated remains, if you will.
Stupid question.
Yeah.
The military cemetery, was that on the original Denny Grant?
No. Well, that was a piece of the tract when he bought the property. Yes, they owned that property, but it wasn't. And while Denny's were alive, it was never a part of the cemetery. But that chunk of ground was part of that tract. Yeah. 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 This is just kind of a couple interesting pictures I threw in for you. This is the first placement in the Veterans Cemetery. And that was in 1927. There was a couple days apart where the first placement occurred and then the first government headstone occurred. Yeah. That was the first burial, Sunday, June 19th, 1927, for John Hatfield in Veterans Memorial Cemetery. And this was kind of, I feel very fortunate that we've got some of these photographs and some of this history. This was coming across, if you will, that was the original office for Evergreen Cemetery. So that's on the Evergreen side. The first headstone and that placement of that individual, they were removed. They were disinterred from the Evergreen side to go over to the veteran side. This was the coach and all of the military that proceeded from the Evergreen side going over to the Washelli side. And they had the horse-drawn caisson, if you will, for that placement. And that's the placement of the headstone itself, for the first one there. That is one of the 36-pound cannons that came off USS Constitution, old Ironsides. That was the dedication of that. I put this in here just because I thought it was fun. So these are the guns were removed from the scarred and battered deck of the Constitution when that memorable and colorful Old Man O' War was built. The government's offer was accepted, and the guns now stand silent vigils over the graves in Veterans Cemetery.
Is that still there?
Yes, both of the guns are still there. This is an interesting aside. This was the Russian Veterans Society of the World War. That was, they came to Evergreen Washelli back in about 1927, and they wanted to create an area for their veterans, for the Russian veterans that were in the community. And so they sectioned off a piece of that ground, and then later, a number of years later, they put the funds together to put the little chapel together. And that was one of the first in our country that represented that imagery which was used in Russia and other areas. So it's really quite interesting as I look at the correspondence between our cemetery and the folks that were putting it together and all of the work and the effort. fortunately enough, we still have all those letters and all of that information. So it's fun to read it and to see what went into it. But they also wanted to honor their veterans.
And is that
Um,
chapel
that-
ever open?
What's that?
Is that chapel ever open?
No, that is completely ran by that community. And so they just, about 2 years ago, they did a pretty significant renovation to it because it was getting tired. And so they keep it locked. Unfortunately, they had a tremendous amount of trouble with vandalism. And so they removed all of the things that were in there. But now they've renovated the outside, they've renovated some of the inside. So they pretty much just use it for their community.
But it's still active.
Yeah, it is. It, very rare that we will seldom make a placement over there because there's not much space available, and there's not many from that community now that are burying there. So
Those are veterans of the American military.
no, for the folks that are here, that a lot of those were Russian. They were allied at that time to America and in all parts of the world. And that's one of the interesting things I saw as I read through about the closer relationship at that day between us and Russia, and they were more of an ally versus.
So they were in the Russian military.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And then this is just a kind of an up-to-date, kind of give you a few highlights in there. It was in about 73 that they acquired the funeral home. The funeral home sat right about where Verity Credit Union is at. That was the original Evergreen Washelli funeral home. And it was in 1994 that they built the new funeral home where it sits today.
That's the one I was thinking, when I was asking if it was, the other building was on a, coming up, where the funeral home is. I was thinking it was that one.
Yeah, it was over on Meridian. Yeah, it was right over.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yep.
But the other building that you said was the columbarium or whatever, I was thinking
Oh,
the
yeah.
architecture of that.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah, exactly. New funeral home then built in 94. Dave died in July of 2004. I was fortunate enough to then at that point work with a number of years with Dave. He was instrumental. They called him the Wizard of Washelli. He was known throughout the industry as being extraordinarily creative. He was very active in legislative items that affected anything to do with cemetery. And so he was a big voice within the funeral and cemetery world at that point in time. We were very fortunate at that time. Tim and Jay Brammer family purchased our company, and we had the opportunity to work with them for a number of years. In 2014, we built our new care center, which is all of the new crematory facilities, new temperature-controlled areas, all of our infrastructure. We did that in 2014. And then it was in 2018 that we became part of Dignity when Jay and his brother decided to leave funeral service to retire. They stepped out. And then we became part of Dignity with Service Corp International. And I just feel extraordinarily fortunate because through all of these years and all of these changes, I just can't be appreciative enough to how they've taken care of my team. When a company, for me, when they make a commitment and they hold to it no matter what, and they follow up with what they do for my team, that's what means a lot to me because I've been leading the team for a number of years and they're very, very important to me. And they have held to every promise, every commitment they made. Nobody will know it, nobody will see it, but day one, they put a massive amount of investment into some of the areas that were struggling because they were 100 years old. It's never ending with the cemetery. It is just never ending the amount that it takes to put into it. One of the things I didn't mention, and I won't keep going, we're getting close on time here, is one of the interesting things that they did back in the day, back in 1920, when the Evergreen side opened. Washelli did a little bit of this, but before it became a statute in Washington, Evergreen said, every single grave we are going to have endowment care on it. We are going to place funds into the care fund. What they knew at that time and recognized at that time, if you look throughout the state, you look throughout the region, you'll find so many of these little cemeteries that are dilapidated because they simply have no funds. If you have no more space, you have no more burials, you have no more revenue. There is no way. And so it doesn't take long and that begins to fall apart. So what they had the foresight to do is that every single grave, a portion of that money will go into a trust fund. That trust fund can't be touched until the cemetery is at its end. That money then will be used to maintain and operate that cemetery. So today in Washington, if you have a cemetery, it's law, it's mandatory. You have to have an endowment care fund. Once again, they were 100 years ahead of their time. And Washoe did some of that, but they did it a little bit differently. What they did is they put money aside. This is way back in the day. They put money aside, and then they just peeled the interest off of that each year. They never touched the corpus, the fund, but they take the interest so that they could take care of maintenance funds. That's how they paid for all their maintenance. It was pretty darn smart. It never covered the whole bill, but it was the right concept. And so now it's a formality. And so every cemetery that starts, a little different if you have certain religious cemeteries, etc., but that's a sidebar. So, and then just a couple pictures for you. A couple of folks you may recognize in there. One of the deceased that we have is Hiram Gale. When he died at 104, he was the last Civil War veteran in the Pacific Northwest. Got a really cool monument that sits up near where the Chimes Tower is at. Going back, some of you may or may not recognize, we used to have the baseball fields on the Evergreen side. Many families we will hear say, yeah, I played baseball there. Well, on the north end of the Evergreen side, they converted that into baseball fields for a number of years. Baseball teams, kids, etc. would have that. Eventually, that had to be developed into cemetery property. And then you might recognize this gentleman, Thomas Burke, who was a founder of Seattle. Was one of the governors of Seattle. Really, really interesting guy, very influential throughout his years. He was an American lawyer. He helped bring railroads into Seattle and build that. He served as a Chief Justice in the Supreme Court of the Washington Territory. Yeah, and then this you might find kind of interesting. I just found it interesting. So if you've been to Washoe Cemetery, and you see Judge Burke's monument, it's the one that sits up on top of the hill. It kind of stands out. It's got the 4 pillars. I just thought it was kind of fun to see. The columns themselves were 9 tons each. The roof was 12 tons, and the weight of that memorial, which he and his wife are buried in the middle, or they're entombed into that memorial, it's 126 tons. So that's your interesting trivia for the evening. I thought that was kind of fun to see when I ran across this. Cemetery guys were kind of weird. Get all excited about interesting things. Watson Squire, he did 2 tours in the Civil War, served in the 7th Ohio Sharpshooters, and then he also participated in the battles in the Civil War of Nashville, Chickamauga, Osaka, and Mission Ridge. He moved to Seattle, and he became governor of the Territory of Washington in 1884 to 1887. And he's got kind of a fun monument as well. Might recognize Dorothy Bilk and her family, her father, huge influence in timber and other resources within the Seattle area. It was kind of fun because it was about in her 40s when Dorothy's husband died, her father died, and I think it was her brother that died. And she pretty much grabbed the bootstraps and said, oh, okay, I guess I better run this company. And he just did a wonderful, wonderful job. She was the one that brought King Broadcasting, brought television to Seattle.
Where are the graves in the cemetery?
They are over on the Washoe side. You might recognize that, the Stimson. There's the Stimson monument that's over there. It's over kind of in the Sleepy Hollow area. And then last of all, the challenges with the cemetery, they are literally an above-ground museum. You can walk through, and there are so many stories to be told. I just wanted to hit a couple of wave tops. One of the things we're very, very proud of is that we are in care of 7 Medal of Honor recipients. And for a cemetery of our size, really for a cemetery of almost any size, that is very significant. So it's just part of our tie to that community And one of the gentlemen that their email block, his son David, often plays taps for us at Memorial Day and Veterans Day and has helped us out with other things. We recently did a big Civil War service for many folks, individuals, and it's just great to have those ties. It's a very important part of what we do. And so there's kind of history, kind of fun. I would love to answer any questions that you may have.
Scott, my girlfriend, I told her we were doing this, she said, Babyland actually had a neon sign that said Babyland.
I don't know about a neon sign. There was the Washelli neon sign, but I don't know about Babyland.
She remembered one that was pink and blue and said Baby.
Yeah, that could be. If I do, I haven't run across that. Yes, sir.
The question about the Jewish cemeteries, the martyrs, next to the Wilson thing, that is the.
Yep. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's an interesting little nugget that still remains a bit of a mystery because I know that I can find some pieces in our history that says how they cut that section out. That was for the Jewish cemetery. So that section, I don't know if we somehow at a point in time sold that to the Jewish community or what happened there, because it's always been a bit of a mystery because it sits right surrounded by us, but it's actually part of the Jewish congregation. Yeah, but it's funny because that's one of those things where I go, I can't connect the dots. When did it happen?
They also have a wire around it.
Yeah.
Which separates.
Yep, exactly. Yes, sir.
So maybe the general question about segregation in cemeteries, I presume it wasn't unique here, that it happened all over the country, but did those communities buy parts of the cemetery, or how did that happen?
Yeah, for example, if you go into on the Washelli side, you find Pacific Lutheran. That was a big group of Lutherans that said, well, can we kind of congregate here, so to speak, because that's what they did. And then you have Chung Hua that said, can we buy a section because we're a benevolent association, we want to have an area for us. The Greek church said, could we buy a section because we would really like to have that community for us? So you're correct. That is very common, especially days of yesteryear, where communities would buy sections or areas.
Of nationalities too. Really.
Yes. Yep. Yes, sir.
What's the cemetery that's across 115th?
That's part of Beaker Colum as well. That's the other piece of the Jewish cemetery.
Okay.
Yeah. So they have both sides of that. By the way, earlier when I mentioned, I was talking about the Masonic Cemetery. That's Lakeview. So Masonic Cemetery changed the name to Lakeview. When they closed the original first cemetery, the Seattle Cemetery, and they wanted to name it something. They started with, I think it was Lake Park or something. The names got confused. So it eventually became a different name. So there's some confusion in that. But that actually is where Lakeview came from, is they called it originally the Masonic, and then eventually it became Lakeview.
That's the one by Volunteer Park.
Yeah, that's,
Where was the white church?
that was, the location was down, might have to look it up. It was down like let's say, that wasn't First and Stewart. I'm blanking on that, but it was in that area.
How about Maynard Point?
Maynard Point, I do not know. They referenced it, but I've never taken the time to go deep enough to figure out specifically where they were at. Where they came up was when they were interviewing, I think it was Arthur Denny, and he talked about Maynard Point, and then he had indicated, yes, early on, we did make burials there. There was a handful or two. Yeah.
What happened to the people who were buried on that hotel that was way up?
Yep, they all ended up, for the most part, all going to the first Seattle cemetery. So the Denny Hotel. Yeah. So for some of those folks, by the time they made the final stop, they were disinterred and reburied 4 times. So, yeah.
So I'm not sure if I missed it, but David Denny and Jonathan, they're buried on the Washelli side.
Right.
And is there some kind of monument for them?
There is, yeah. There's the Denny Monument. It's like a big boulder. And there's also a sidebar story, but there is Louisa supposedly had brought sweetbriar roses seeds from Illinois when they migrated west, and that she had planted those throughout Seattle, and that there were some of those same seeds planted there, because they called her I think it was the Rosebriar Bride. Something
So are
like that.
those roses still there?
Yes, they are. There are some there. Are they still exactly that same vintage? That's a piece I don't know. A couple of their family members come out from the East Coast about every year, every other year, and they clean the monuments, and we keep some stuff just for them. We keep a few of their brushes and things like that. So, but yeah, their whole family, if you walk through there, you'll be able to see quite a few of the Denny family there. There's also quite a few that are up at Lakeview. Yes, ma'am.
When they would move from place to place, was it up to the families to pay for that, or the cemetery?
No, they when you read it, you'll see that they covered the cost of all of that. So to do the disinterment, to do the transfer, to take the monument, they covered the city covered those costs.
The city.
Yeah, yeah. The family wasn't responsible for that, for sure.
There's two more over here and then we're.
Okay.
I have a non-historical question and
Okay.
a current one. What is happening in that lower section in the southeast? Yeah, where the coyotes are. Is that beehives? And is who's doing that?
That is a group that we have worked with now for about 3 years, and they're beekeepers. And so if you are served by Evergreen Washelli, one of our little gift bags will actually have Washelli honey. So they harvest the honey for their own needs, and they sell their honey, they do all that, and then we also take some of their honey and we make those little gift packages. But environmentally, they really do a lot of good work with the bees, and they put on classes down there. We keep it fairly low profile because we have had one occurrence where random folks went in there and caused all kinds of damage and havoc and tore up their hives, and so they had to rebuild that. But that's exactly what we're doing.
And I noticed that they're like.
That's kind of hidden. It's on the Washelli side, and if you were looking at kind of where the Greek dome is at, there's a hill where we put the extra dirt there. Down in the bottom of that, we put a lot of our chips and things like that down there, and you'll see beehives down there as well. Yeah.
This is the last one here.
Okay.
So, can you go into specific, look at a little bit more? I mean, was that originally a totally separate cemetery?
No, it's a section, just a
So
section.
it's always just been a section?
Yep.
But there's a sign.
Yep.
As you come in.
Pacific Louis. Yep. No, it was just, and you'll find that throughout the area that there is a lot of sections, and they will have their own name. They will have their own title. And so, yeah, but it was never a separate cemetery. So. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to do
We have one more person who's going to give us a little 5-minute thing about NCAT. Okay, good, okay. That's Melinda.
Okay.
I'll just stand over here so I can look at everybody. Okay, I'll see you.
Okay. I'm Melinda Jacobson, longtime resident of Aller Lake, and I'm a board member for the North Precinct Advisory Committee. And they've asked me to take a little survey. Has anybody here ever heard or participated in the public safety survey? Just one person. It happens once a year. They're in the 10th year now. It usually lasts for about a month. And they've advertised it in the Seattle Times, on Nextdoor, various Facebook pages. So does that ring a bell with anybody besides Henry? No?
I was a politician.
Okay, well that answers, I won't continue any longer. We're just trying to get some feedback because the city divides, Seattle U puts it on in conjunction with the police department, and they divide the city in different sections. And so you find your section and you say what your concerns are about public safety. And I just wanted to find out if anybody has done that, if your concerns have been met at all.
Could you put the link for that in our firework splashes?
It finished on November 30th,
Okay.
so it'll be next year. But I'm curious, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but has it helped you at all?
So my name's Henry Paulette. I'm with Councilmember Kathy Moore's office. We know that that's part of one of the tools that Seattle Police Department uses for kind of long-term safety planning. So we've taken some of that information and used it in the past. I think that we're looking at a lot of environmental tools to address public safety issues, and that's really helping us kind of target where we're doing a lot of that work. So it's useful for us.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm done.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. It's a lot.